Hello?
Tired man.
Hey there. We are here for the fun. This is where the fun is.
I knew I could find it where you were.
Obvious question is it fun because Suzanne's here? Or is Suzanne here because it's fun?
You know, I think that tends to heterodyne, so I'll say both.
Okay.
It's fun because you're here, Warren. How's that?
I strongly doubt that.
Yeah.
So
It's
nice
a stone
setup,
soup
though.
thing.
But we're glad you are. So we're glad.
It's a stone soup thing. Everybody brings the fun. See what you started, Paul?
Now I know better. As you know, I get my fun mostly from the bottom of a cup.
So, chairs, just as a note, I'm not going to be able to take minutes during
Yes.
my
Yes, we discussed that.
Great.
Yep. And Paul, those slides that couple of slides I sort of summarized some stuff. We can use those whenever you see fit, sort of thing. It was mostly to try to jog memory, sort of thing.
Okay. Well, I'll go through mine, and then we can switch to yours.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that works. Because we just wanted to put together the mailing list discussion around the issues that are already in your slides. So coordination is a wonderful thing.
Cool.
It's
Thank you,
team
Paul.
effort, gang. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And we still have people joining, so we will, what, guys, give it a couple more minutes?
A couple more minutes.
Because we don't want to, this is the thing about having one short meeting, is that we want to get down to business fairly quickly, but we don't want to lose people out.
Yes. And we're going to use that hedge doc thing that I know you despise, Paul Hoffman, just for us to sort of keep track of stuff.
That's not mine.
Yep.
All right, the 1 minute warning.
So, final check if everything works. Do you hear me, Suzanne?
Yep.
Excellent.
So I know any of us can go through the chair slides, but Benno, did you want to do that, or I can do it?
I think Tim wants to kick off. He prepared some slides also for the terminology draft.
So I think Suzanne, since you're running the slides, you can do it. And what we'll do, Benno, with those, of course, I just delegated.
Very smart. Okay, I can do that.
And the summarizing, as Paul said, after he talks, we can throw those up. So,
okay, excellent.
Yep,
we'll do that.
That works.
Benno, you are sharing, so.
Okay, thank you. We start. We start at 30, so we still need one participant.
We had 30, and then somebody ducked out.
Okay.
But we shall waste no more time on our
internal procedures.
Eagerness for all of us to do our part here.
Yeah. So welcome, everyone. Everybody sees the slides well? Sharing. Okay. Welcome for the DNSOP interim meeting. We have an agenda. But first, of course, the chairs, Suzanne, Tim, and myself. Warren as the responsible area director. Well, thank you, Tim. We have a Twitter handle. So everyone, we can also put it on the mailing list, but the working group has an has a Twitter handle, a Twitter account, ITF_-DNSOP. working group _DNSOP. We also, we already announced our meetings on the Twitter, and we already have a number of followers. So please spread the word. The Jabber room is open. I think there's people already in. The minutes are taken using the notes tool. See here below the link, and a volunteer or DNSOP chairs will work on the notes on the minutes here. Of course, with all meetings, we assume that you are aware of the note well. So that, and of course, also important, the code of conduct. Respect each other and be constructive. Good. This is our agenda for this evening. For today. So the DNS terminology, we discussed that already earlier and also on the mailing list. We think it's a good shape. We have to discuss a number of open issues. So we reserved 30 minutes with Paul. And the second draft on the agenda is the delegation revalidation with Schumann, Paul Vixie, and Puneet is added as an editor to the document. So thank you, Puneet. That's the agenda. Of course, are there any questions, feedback, additions? Did I miss something? Raise your hand. Otherwise, we go to the first presenter, Paul Hoffman. Yeah, thank you. Paul, I can. What do you want to share? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you want to share your slides, your own, or shall I share the slides on my desktop?
I thought I was going to. I have requested the ability to.
Okay, I don't. Oh, yeah. Grant screen. Yeah, sorry, I was.
Let's see if this works.
Yeah, you appeared 2 times on my on my desk.
Sorry, the window that I want is not being shown because why should it? Okay, well, here.
Yeah, your deck is preloaded if you want to.
Yeah,
I'll
actually use the horrible thing called PowerPoint, which is what I use to do it. And so I guess I enter full screen here. And you know what? I'm just going to do it this way. You all are seeing these?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Excellent.
So Kazunori and I have been watching the mailing list. There's this is for RFC 8499 BIS. And at this point, we believe there are only 2 topics that have been discussed on the list for changes in the draft. The term in bailiwick and the term glue. So what I'm going to do today is present on these 2, and then I'm going to stop presenting because in both cases, there is discussion on the mailing list. There doesn't seem to be consensus. I am a great believer that consensus is managed by the working group chairs, not by document authors. I have opinions. I'm sure some of you have noticed that. But in fact, what we really want is consensus on where to go. So like I say, I have a couple of slides on these 2 topics, and then I'll hand it over to the chairs who, have a better ability than I do on calling consensus in a fair fashion. So let's do in bailiwick first. So the definitions that are in the current draft were added in RFC 8499. That is, remember 8499 is the V2 of our terminology document. They were added after a bunch of discussion, but they became controversial, of course, after 8499 was published. Tony Finch started a thread, I want to say a year ago, but given COVID, who knows how time works. But we restarted those last month in November. There is a link here for the summary of where it went. That was, well, I guess it wasn't November because that's actually October. Again, COVID and time. Whee! So The basic problem we have for in bailiwick is that there are no definitions in the source RFCs. We can't say, here is how in bailiwick was defined before. So what we've done in RFC 8499 is we came up with some definitions, and then we added sibling glue, and we added a few things. But there is now a large disagreement about whether whether it's better to say what we got or to leave it undefined. There is, in my mind, and again, just my mind, a weak consensus, not a strong consensus, to abandon any discussion, because any discussion that gives definitions will be confusing and not necessarily match what people are saying. I have a preference to try to define things. That's why, I started the original document. And I believe that Kazunori also, since he has done a lot of refinement on some of my blathering, would also like things defined. But personally, I don't want to define something that's just, this seems okay for a few people. So as the chairs will have it, we might want to put something in for bailiwick and in bailiwick and out of bailiwick, even if it is a non-definition, even if it is something saying, gosh, we can't define it. Or the working group might come to consensus on a definition. So do look at that archive, although Tim, you said that you were going to be summarizing there, but it would be good for us to deal with this because it is a term. It is a term that people hear, and we should at least acknowledge that it's a term that people hear. So going on a bit, let's deal with glue. So here is the first part of the current text, which quotes a little bit out of RFC 1034, which talks about what happens if you don't have glue, basically. It sort of says what glue is, but it doesn't actually say this is glue. And then here's more of the text that's in the current document in 8499 and in the draft, which says, okay, well then with that, but a later definition says this, which is from RFC 2181. And we also say, although glue is sometimes used today with this wider definition, the context surrounding the definition in 2181 suggests that it was intended only to apply to the use of glue within the document itself and not necessarily beyond. That confused a lot of people. It's like, well, are we using the stuff from 2181 or not? So I looked around generally at how people talk about glue, and we've actually in the IETF had a couple of discussions specifically related to glue in the last couple of years for things in the deprive working group. That is, if you want to have things attested to by a parent in a signed way and such, that is not what they're normally attesting to. What are they attesting to? Are they signing the glue? And so people use the word glue a lot, and that's been coming up in other places. So I have proposed this definition, where I'm ripping out some of this stuff and trying to give a succinct definition. I think we can agree that not everyone will agree with this definition of glue, because some people think glue is what they think glue is at the moment. And we've certainly seen that in the discussions around deprive, where some people will say glue is only addresses. It's how you find the server. And other people will say, no, glue is about what we know about the server that is not signed by the authoritative. So here's what I'm proposing, that we quote from 1034 that says data that allows access to name servers for subzones is sometimes called glue data. Sometimes it's called whatever Paul Maka Petrus felt in 30 years ago, but sometimes it's called glue data. So, but 1034 also then says, to fix this problem, a zone contains glue RRs, which are not part of the authoritative data and are address RRs for the server. So that part, I think everyone agrees that glue contains addresses. These RRs are only necessary if the name server's name is below the cut and are only used as part of the referral response. We might even cut out those last two sentences from this definition of glue, but it gives a little bit of context. But I also think it's important to then quote the second part, which says, glue above includes any records in a zone file that is not properly part of that zone, including name server records of delegated subzones, NS records, address records that accompany those NS records. I like the fact that they have A, quad A, and etc., trying to predict for IPv8, and any other stray data that might appear. So 2181 specifically talked about other stray data, which is, I guess, the stuff we're talking about in deprive certainly could be called stray data, because it's signatures and certificates and such like that. So this is my proposal for a succinct definition of glue that I think will probably piss some people off because of the second part. But if we didn't include the second part, that would piss some people off because they're thinking of glue that way. So then this is where I hand it off to the chairs. What do we want to do about in bailiwick and the current section? And is this simplification of glue sort of what we want? And I think with that, I will stop
Thanks, Paul.
sharing. Yep.
And then we'll throw up the slides.
Sharing.
Benno, if you want to throw that first one up. Mostly what we tried to do is sort of summarize some of the mailing list discussion. So we had it best in our head, right? As well. And Paul Waters did a good job sort of writing a bunch of this up. And then he had a comment about sibling zones and sibling glue, which seemed to get some like agreement, like this seemed to make sense. Sibling zones being two zones whose delegations are in the same parent zone, and then sibling glue, the addresses of name servers that are in a sibling zone. Those seem to get some, like, oh, people seem to be okay with that on the mailing list. A side note, I was looking at the glue is on optional draft, and they use, instead of bailiwick, they use in-domain glue, which I think, is a reasonable, it's like, okay, that sort of, is a useful sort of data point. I know Tony was saying that in bailiwick he feels is sort of overused. One thing that we thought is keeping separate the glue definitions for the DNS protocol, like what does DNS need for glue versus what like a registry requirements would need. And I do think we should definitely keep those separate and define those, and maybe they're not both called glue, maybe they're called something different. I don't know. But I don't like to get them. I think when we mix them up, it gets things all sideways. And then on the next page was something from one of Tony's emails. I know I asked him about coming, but he's switching jobs and he's sort of tied up, so he apologized. And Benno, I think on the next page, Tony had made a comment. In bailiwick, he called it the property of a name server, which did not seem completely accurate. Or is it the property of the NSA records of the Q name, right? So that was something that sort of popped up in that, and then he said, well, we can't use in bailiwick anymore, so we've got to just sort of, move on to something else. So that was where I sort of saw that mail thread. So I'd love to hear some comments on folks. Let's go back and talk about this. Where do people think we're going to go with this? I don't want to get rid of in bailiwick, or I don't want to get rid of that definition. The name is probably, it will change, but what we do with it, I think, does need to be better defined.
Paul, please go ahead. You raise your hand, Paul. Yeah.
Mr. Vixie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be Paul Hoffman, not Paul Vixie.
Okay.
I think both of us appreciate that. So going back one slide, I think we have an issue here where we are now mixing up bailiwick and glue. And I would like to discuss them separately.
I agree.
I absolutely agree with you, Tim, or with chairs, assuming that you all discuss this, that we should keep separate any definitions from the DNS protocol versus registry requirements. Registry requirements came well after 1034, 1035, or even 2181. Registries have different requirements. For the definition of bailiwick, I would absolutely not want to have anything about registries there. That is, a registry is a zone holder, and they should do exactly everything that is needed to hold a zone. I also don't think we should be talking about that. I'm skipping ahead now, but I also don't think we should be talking about registry requirements for glue. That is, even if registries have contracts with, say, a certain organization about how they handle glue, if we haven't defined glue well, that's our fault. We should not be taking somebody else's interpretation of how we defined it badly or didn't define it, and then say, oh, well, since they think we defined it this way, we should follow along. I think that that's actually really a bad idea, given that we, both 1034 and 2181 had a picture of what they meant with glue. But let's note that they didn't talk about bailiwick. And so I think it's okay to say people started using this term. You know what? We probably shouldn't have. To me, that's an okay outcome. I think we should acknowledge that the term was being used. And I'm not in favor of saying some people think X and some people think Y, because there's absolutely going to be people who think Z, and a fair number of people who will think X, today and Y tomorrow. But I think it would be good for us to acknowledge it.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're in violent agreement on some of that. So, and yes, we don't want to actually touch the registry stuff. I think staying away from that is the right way to go. Mr. Vixie, I think your hand is up. Or
no.
Oh, sorry. Maybe it's just the way it's showing up on my queue. I apologize.
Oh, please, Matthijs, please go ahead.
Yeah, listening to the discussion on glue, I'm wondering if we need a separate word for the later definition of glue.
Are we here to invent terminology?
So to answer Paul, yes, we are. That is, we actually defined a bunch of new terms in the documents. Was that a good idea? Most of the time, yes.
To me,
Matthias, when you say the later definition, do you mean the part from 2181 that said and other things?
Yes. So to me, it sounds like we have now two definitions, which is referred to by glue. And hearing the discussion, it sounds like it's confusing. So that's why I'm wondering if we need a new terminology. Or are we going to say both things are going to be referred to as glue? Then people will keep using the word glue, and I think we will live on with the confusion. If that makes sense.
I thought we were talking about bailiwick, not glue.
No, my point was specifically about the glue. Sorry if I jumped subjects.
Thank you, Matthijs. No, so there's definitely an opportunity to update definitions or to introduce or more specific definitions if there's confusion. And there's also a remark by Fujiwara-san and Schumann about the other drafts. DNSOP glue is not optional. That the definition should be in sync, should be consistent. So waiting for, or indeed, we don't necessarily have to wait for the draft to be finished. DNSOP glue is not optional, but work towards the same definition between the authors and the working group, of course. So back to Paul Hoffman, speaking out for consensus today. It is well, that's not what we can achieve today.
One thing that it's useful to point out is that previously there have been multiple cases in the terminology documents where what we ended up documenting was that a particular term was ambiguous. And we could either discuss, how different operators, different participants in the system are using the same term and document that it is ambiguous and it is context dependent, or even say, we don't think there are consistent definitions here and suggest not using the term at all. So we have a few degrees of freedom here, but because we're talking about a definition document, we do have to be pretty careful not to attribute clarity to a definition that doesn't really exist.
Agree. Yeah. Yeah.
I like Warren's comment in the chat, but I over the years I have increasingly come to hate the term bailiwick. So that's a personal opinion and probably varies widely. And it would be good to hear from folks about which of these terms you think is clear enough and useful enough that we can define reasonably precisely.
Yeah.
And
I think that's important indeed. Is it useful to have the definition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The important thing is which of these terms is useful and how to define them in the most useful way.
Yeah. Paul Hoffman.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think that's good. I'm still a little bit grafrobbled because we're talking bailiwick and glue at the same time here. Given what you just said, I think a reasonable way forward is for us to have a entry for bailiwick that says basically what a few people on the list have said, which is this is not a useful term. The differences in definitions are fairly huge, and therefore it's not a useful term. Glue, I think that everyone agrees, is a useful term, and we might have to and I sort of tried to in the in my proposal show the two different ways that it's used. I don't think that there are more than those two different ways. And I'm sensitive to what Matthias suggested about maybe having a different term for the 2181 definition, which is addresses plus cruft. But I would certainly want to see a discussion on the mailing list about that. But I think you're right, Suzanne, that we can say this term is not a useful term because it has, so many definitions. And I would lay that for bailiwick.
Go ahead, Warren.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, no hats. I agree it's useful to say things like, this term is not a useful term and people shouldn't use it. But if possible, I think it might also be nice to have some people, the reason it's not a useful term is some people use it to mean sort of this, and some people use it to mean sort of that, and some people use it to mean something completely different. And my thought for that is, I think a lot of non-DNS people are also going to look at this document. And when their random DNS expert tells them, the reason your domain doesn't work is because the non-bailiwick in zone glue is not actually working. They would like to have some way of knowing that A, the person's making up random bits, and B, sort of what they might have been trying to say. I don't know if we could actually word that in a more useful manner, but some sort of like, this term should be deprecated. If you come across it in legacy use, it might sort of mean this, but it's also very vague. So that's just sort of a rough pointer.
Yep. No, absolutely, Warren. And I think we do need to define it, because I know I point people, non-DNS people, to this document to read about stuff like glue and things of that nature, right? And as Paul mentioned, there is this issue coming up in DPRIVE about what people think about is glue, non-DNS people trying to do stuff. And I don't fault them. It's just that we're not defining it in a clearer way.
Okay. Paul, does that give you direction
and
for?
We'll talk with Paul, and well, at least, yes, I think we can sort of start beating a path forward.
No to Suzanne, and I look forward to Tim.
Okay.
With Paul, yeah.
It does feel like we've made some progress here, if only by saying what we're not trying to do. But yeah, let's certainly folks are welcome to have additional commentary on the mailing list about how these terms should be defined. And we will attempt to get some new text after some further discussion with Paul, just about what that should look like.
Yeah. So I think it's useful to have a summary of this discussion on the mailing list, so people have context. Who's action holder of that? Is that
us.
chair, or can we delegate
That's
that?
chair's action.
Yep.
Okay.
And moving on to Schumann, I guess, is presenting.
Yes. Yeah. Schumann, I think you're the presenter. You want to share the slides? I will stop sharing this.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So, Benno, I think if you drive the slides for me, that would be a bit better, because the last time I tried, I wasted everyone's time for 5 minutes. So.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So, yep.
Okay. So we're trying to wrap up work on the delegation revalidation draft that's been lingering for a while in the working group. So I think the bulk of the draft is largely done. We just have a few remaining issues, and a bunch of us finally found the time to get together to identify those issues. As you might have heard, Paul suddenly has a lot of free time on his hands now, so that's very good. And we also recruited Puneet to help us out, who was already involved in early discussions of the draft anyway. So next slide, please. All right, so I'd like to reorder the discussion a bit and move this item to the end so that we can get through some of the quicker items first. But essentially, we describe in the draft a simple and a more detailed revalidation algorithm. And there was a bit of pushback against the complex one. So this simple approach came from a suggestion from Ralph Delmans and ML Labs. And the more complex one is the original one from Paul's Res Improved draft. But so the three of us talk, and Paul now has some new clarifying and motivating text for the latter, and we'd like him to discuss and walk through that in some detail. So we'll leave that to the end, and let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next issue is the DSTTL and how, if any, in any way it should be used as part of revalidation. So interestingly, the DNS protocol specs today say that the DS and the delegating NSTTL should match, but in practice that's not really true for a variety of reasons. So the latest text says that resolvers may use the DSTTL in preference to the delegating NS to compute the revalidation interval. And we didn't really have a good sense for whether there was consensus for that text. All I recall is that no one objected to it. But we now have a slightly different proposal and that is to use the lower of the DNS and NSTTL. So we'd like to see what folks think about that. So let's see, I don't know if we're going to take comments now. Maybe we'll do it at the end. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so there's a section on delegation changes in the -01 of the draft. Again, there were no objections that we heard around this, but we wanted to explicitly understand if there is consensus for this text. So this is, by the way, a pretty important aspect of the original Res Improved draft's motivation, namely to try to clear stale data from the cache under the zone cut whose parameters may have changed because of, say, complete removal of the delegation or redelegation of the zone to completely new servers, as that stale data may be unsafe to use. So think of situations like domain takedowns for malware or hosting of other pernicious content. We do want to avoid unnecessary churn though, so we explicitly carve out an exception for situations in which only a subset of the name servers have changed. In that case, no cache cleanup is necessary or even desired. Next slide, please. There was a suggestion made to include a treatment in the draft of what resolvers should do if the entire NS set is assessed to be lame. That is, if we can't reach any of the name servers for the child zone. And the proposal was to say that resolvers should go back and try to continue to perform revalidation, but with some sort of hold down timer so that they aren't constantly spinning in a loop trying to do this and effectively causing a denial of service attack. So our current thinking is that we don't really need to discuss this. Resolvers already have to deal with this situation, whether they implement this draft or not, and presumably they already have a sensible way to deal with this. So in the interest of keeping the draft simple and focus on its main goal, our suggestion is that we don't say anything about this, but we're open to alternative thoughts on that topic. Let's move on to the next slide. There were a couple of optimization suggestions that have been made. These ones I think mainly came from Olafur and friends at Cloudflare. So the first one is that resolvers could cache whether or not an authority server is doing minimal responses or full responses with the NS set populated in the authority section of the responses. And if they were doing the latter, then we could forego explicit child NS set fetches for subsequent interactions with those authority servers. So on the face of it, this sounds reasonable and it might save the resolver some work, but we have a few concerns. It does involve additional complexity, storing additional state on the resolver for a currently unknown gain, right? I think you'd have to do a kind of a measurement study to figure out whether or not it's worth doing or not. And also the other issue is how to quickly and correctly detect state changes on the authoritative server if they change from minimal to non-minimal, et cetera, et cetera. So our current suggestion after voicing those concerns is maybe we'll just leave this topic out of the draft. Next slide. Another optimization that was suggested was for the authoritative servers. So if they are employing minimal responses, what they could do is proactively populate the NS set in the authority section only of responses to the DNS key queries. So the idea is this could obviate the need for resolvers doing explicit child NS set fetches for sign zones. However, again, the question here is, this is additional complexity for unknown gain, or at least as of yet unquantified gain. And also this kind of moves the draft into discussion of authoritative server behavior, which it wasn't doing before. It was focused only on resolver behavior. So this kind of expands the scope of the document beyond its original intentions. And, maybe we should have some concerns about doing that. So again, our suggestion is a reasonable idea to consider and think through, but let's not discuss this in the draft for now. And let's move on to the next slide, which is abuse prevention. So I have brought up this issue in the past of how resolvers can protect themselves against abusive configurations deployed by others that may make them, do too much work. But we haven't said anything about this in the draft yet. But once we recruited Puneet into this effort, he raised it again. So resolvers clearly should bound the amount of work they're willing to do, right? That's as a general principle, not specifically having to do with this draft alone. But the way that thing could surface in this draft is if authoritative servers are deploying extremely low TTLs and causing resolvers to perform very, very frequent revalidations. And the obvious suggestion here to mitigate that is that resolvers should place some kind of lower bound on how frequently they're willing to revalidate. And so, we should state something about that in the draft, along with possibly recommending a default value for that lower bound, but we're open to suggestions and discussions on that point. And next slide, please. Okay, all right, so before we go to the Q&A, as I mentioned, let's come back to discussion of the detailed revalidation algorithm. And Paul, you want to take it from here?
I would, thank you. May I have permission to broadcast?
Definitely, yes. You want to share a screen?
I do.
Yeah. You can, oh, there you are. Yeah, granted.
Oh, all the slots for the requested media are already taken.
I will stop sharing. That might be one of the, that was the, yeah, the culprit. Yeah.
Okay, it's asking me what I want to share. That's very cool. I normally expect explosive decompression under these conditions, but okay, Windows rides again. By the way, I was not the first person in this meeting to use PowerPoint. This is about the complicated part, which was section 4 of that draft. And to remind everyone, this came from an expired draft from 2010. And so the text that was in there was a little bit naive, as such things turn out to be in hindsight. In particular, it allowed the TTL within a resource record set to vary, and that is, in fact, not allowed anymore and is treated as a format error by some pretty popular resolvers. So that part is gone, and the draft is better for it. Now, a simpler approach was proposed for this draft, and that won't work, and I'll explain why. And then I'll tell you the clearer approach, which has not been seen by the mailing list, partly because it was done at about midnight, and partly because it uses the term in bailiwick, which I now understand we can't use. So I've got some rework to do, and I'm hoping to get some input from this interim meeting on those topics so that I can then post this text to the mailing list. This text, by the way, is not in the current draft, but it is inclusive of everything else that is in the current draft. It does not mention the prevention of abuse because that was left as an unknown, but the other changes which Shubhan has enumerated here are coherent with this, or this is coherent with them, as you prefer. I do want to say that the ResImprove keyword has taken off. I'm happy to have inspired this residential improvement e-commerce site. I'm not affiliated. Here's the simple mechanism, and it won't work, partly because there isn't a normal iterative algorithm that would cause delegation revalidation. In other words, it is perfectly valid behavior to let the NS set expire And it doesn't matter whether you're parent first or child first, you can let that expire if you are using what's called minimal responses. And because in that case, you're not going to be including the NS set even in negative answers as described in 2308 as a negative proof. And so it's perfectly valid to continue using cached information even if there are potentially no NS records above it in your cache. And also, if we wanted to take this approach, we'd have two other problems. One is that the revalidation process still has to be described. And the other problem is more than one delegating NS set can be stale in this way. And you can't just go to the closest encloser because that may be inside of, let's say, a data attacker's delegation hierarchy, and they may put a longer TTL on that just to frustrate naive revalidation. You really have to be able to look at the entire upward chain to make sure that the entire upward chain is still valid in the sense of TTL coverage, so that it kind of holds up, if you will. It becomes the foundation, the virtual foundation under the answer record that you wish to use in a response. So I was inspired by this because, not because it was correct, but because it was clear. And so I tried to be clearer. I've rewritten section 4. I'm not going to go through every point in detail because, again, I have to clean up this language, remove the in-bailiwick references, and so on. But I do want to walk through it briefly just so that the approach that is taken can at least be reviewed here, even if the total detail is not. So first, this is the essence of the whole thing. You have to describe what revalidation means. You can't refer to it as something that should be done. You have to describe what it means to do it. And this is expected to be done sort of starting from the owner name of the answer record set and then working your way upward, first to the closest encloser, then to the delegation that leads to that, and so forth back to the root. In a non-hierarchical cache implementation, you don't have a sort of a tree of name nodes that you could walk in that way. And so in that approach, in that sort of architecture, it would be necessary to tag each delegation with the one it came from so that you can walk through them up toward the root. So that is a point which was not raised in the 2010 text, but which will be covered here. So we're talking about the delegating or ancestral NSRR set. And you could say the parent zone, and perhaps that is a change I will make after hearing the previous part of this working group meeting. But the idea is for a delegation, you have to know where it came from, and you have to know what it said. At least you have to remember what the NS record set was above the cut and what the TTL of that was. And you also have to remember the DS TTL. You don't have to remember the DS record set. That could be allowed to expire. If you're not a validator, you probably don't care, but you have to remember what the TTL of that was, because you need to minimize against those. In other words, the shorter of the TTL for the NS record set and DS record set is what you actually use for revalidation. So what it means to revalidate is to just determine whether the delegating NS record set has been remembered for too long. If you had it in cache longer than the lower of the two TTLs, then it's kind of out of time. I don't want to use the term expired here because expired would mean it's bad and it must be refetched. What you're doing is you're saying, is it still valid? And if it is, then you're not going to change anything in some cases. So in the language of the following paragraphs, the point at which a delegation to a delegation, or actually any delegation point, has been discovered to be out of time, that delegation is referred to in the following text as a revalidation point. This is the hard part. This is the part that is still complicated in the style of 2010, and it uses in bailiwick. And by the way, the logic from 2010 was written up after it had been implemented in a name server which was not open source and so never saw the light of day. And while rewriting this text, I found a bug in the mechanism, which in fact was present in the code. So this has been useful, although that code base is dead. So what you have to do is sort of walk upward toward the root and find a delegation somewhere and what it pointed to, where both of them are above the name, at or above the, or the bottom one is at or above the name you want to use, and the top one is, you know, the one you're considering. And so I'm referring to that as the second closest validation point, and that's tricky. But the ultimate mechanism of revalidation is to send a query for some, and I apologize, Mr. Hoffman, in bailiwick name for the second closest cache delegation point. Because what you're hoping to expose here is a response from the delegator that tells you whether the delegation that you want to use is still valid. And that one might also be expired, but you still have to see if the revalidation point says, the servers at the revalidation point say that the delegation you want to use still exists. Because if it doesn't, you've got a lot of pruning to do. And so there's, again, this part is a little bit crazy. It's midnight talk, midnight speak, and I'll improve this before it hits the mailing list. But this is where the bug was. So if the response, and this, by the way, is, as I said earlier, inclusive of Schumann's earlier points, if the response is that the name you want doesn't exist anymore, then you've got to do some pruning. If the referral is to a different name, in other words, the hierarchy has changed shape. Com used to delegate to example.com, but now somehow com delegates to foobar.example. That's allowed. You can have an in bailiwick empty non-terminal or an in zone empty non-terminal in the parent, and so it won't always be semantically the parent zone. It is the ancestor. But if the ancestor is telling you that the shape of the hierarchy has changed, then you got some pruning to do. Or if it's still the same name, but it points at a set of name servers that have nothing in common with the one you had cached, that would be another case where you've got some pruning to do. Now, again, we're using the term in bailiwick. I'll fix that. And so you are, in this case, going to have to go purge some stuff out of the cache. And in a non-hierarchical cache, you probably can't do that in the style of the Unix file system with rm-r because you don't have a hierarchy. And so you'd have to do something else. And you know, you can approximate this in a lot of ways. Lazy generational pruning would be one example. If there's any call for it, we can put that in the appendix and say this is what lazy generational pruning means. But if you don't care because you have your own idea, then there's no requirement to do it in that way. What you have to do is behave as though the data at or below the revalidation point doesn't exist anymore. Somebody asks for it. That might be the point where you lazily remove it from cache, but either way you can't use it. Last slide, I promise. So that new referral is valid data. You got it from an authority, and it should be placed in cache. And if there's something else in cache that is different from that, then you're going to be replacing that with this at the atomic granularity of the resource record set. And then finally, you got to repeat this. So you just go check again to see if everything is still in time. And if you find one that isn't, then according to the traversal logic, which was described earlier, the next one you find is going to be above the one you were just revalidating. And you're going to repeat this either until you reach a work limit. You don't want to spin, CPU loop flooding the network with queries. So there always has to be some kind of loop detection, but you're going to repeat this, potentially revalidating your way all the way up to the root, because what you're looking for is a virtual foundation which will underlie the data you wish to use. And that's my show. I'll stop sharing and turn it back over to Shuman.
Yeah, so Paul, you're going to send out your, once you've finished up the text to the mailing list, right? Because I think we'll need to get people to read in detail the text, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
So the one confusion, yeah, go ahead.
I think in fairness, I will fix this up as best as I can and send it to you and Puneet first, and we will send it to the mailing list after the authors are at least all kind of say, yeah, I know what that means. It's coherent, even if we don't all agree.
All right, yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so the one confusion I had was why if the simple algorithm is applied iteratively to all ancestor delegations, why it doesn't achieve approximately the same effect as your complex algorithm. But I'll wait until I read your full text to try and figure that out.
Yeah, we've only got a few minutes, and Paul and Shuman have said that there will be a new version of the draft. So if folks have comments that will help them make sure that the next draft answers the big questions, addresses at least the first set of concerns that people have, queue is open.
I think Warren is queued.
Thank you. So yeah, a quick question for Paul Vixie. Apologies, but I don't remember how much of the original ResImprove document is not in this document. I think there were a bunch of other useful things. And maybe once this document's done, we can discuss actually doing the rest of the ResImprove doc, because I think it was some really good stuff.
Well, thank you for that. There were 3 points. One has already been covered in the RFC titled NX domain means NX domain. So that's in. Then there's this, and then there was one other which is somewhat obscure, but I would be happy to take it up again. Again, I am unemployed and able to engage.
Thank you. Any other questions, feedback from the working group?
So I think I'll just relay that Puneet was trying to speak, but his audio is not working. But he says, same as Shuman, I will review the proposed text before it is posted to the list.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to the new text. And I think also we should ask the resolver implementers to have a careful look at the text. If it's that I think that's good for review, as Paul said. It's not the simple. Well, as Paul said also, and it's good for have a review, have a reference implementation, etc., etc. So I think it's good to ask the software developers to have a look at it and either make a proof of concept implementation or work forward. Are there any other questions? Feedback, wrap up. Okay, Suzanne, you have some final words? will put on the I will put on my camera. So I'm now.
No worries. I guess I should also.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about some really complex issues today. We kind of dove into some stuff that requires a lot of careful thought. And that's kind of why we started doing the interims, is so that we could focus on one topic or two topics for a more significant amount of time. But people still need to go ahead and send text and review the written document as it evolves. So thanks everybody for your time today. And we're looking forward to further discussion on these issues on the mailing list. Definitely chair's action item to work with Paul Hoffman on straightening out which terms we're defining and which terms we're pointing out
all the authors,
may not be that
Kazunori
useful.
as well. Yep.
I'm sorry?
Kazunori as well.
Yeah. Apologies, Fujiwara-san. But we do need to go ahead and review carefully, send text, and so we are looking forward to that on the mailing list also.
Yep. That concludes our interim meeting. Thank you. Looking back at this is the third interim meeting this year, and again, well, as Suzanne already put it, I think it's very useful. The chairs are very happy with it. We make good progress, and we'll certainly plan more of these interim meetings. Did we already? Well, most likely another one before the IETF in March. The dates, etc., will be well. We will send polls, a doodle to the mailing list to select a date. And of course, if there are authors, so we can of course approach authors of document editors. We think are ready for well, either a 30-minute plus discussion, or if authors would like to have more exposure, please reach out to us. Send us an email, and we can discuss plans for the interim meeting.
Yeah, that means that this is the last one this year. So thanks everybody for showing up, participating, contributing in 2021. Happy New Year. And here's to a 2022 when we might actually get to see each other, but we'll continue the good work. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you all.